When most people think about women during the Second World War, generally speaking, they think of the good old American women working in the factories at the home front, which is fine, and partially true, but that's only a fragment of the whole story. First, I'll have to backtrack a bit. First wave feminism had been won, and women could vote. But after the relative liberty of the 1920s, the 1930s was a very socially conservative time, and it was often thought that women working in anything besides traditional feminine roles, such as nurses or teachers, were what caused the Great Depression. Initially, women were put at the bottom of the list for factory work, for it was believed they could not understand the complex machinery. However, as the war raged on, more and more soldiers were sent out, and more supplies were needing to be made. So women finally made it into the factories after the famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaign, and man, did they come in floods. There were about 4 million women working in the factories in the USA alone in 1942. But a lesser-known fact about the Western women of World War II was that they did actually work in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. In the US, there was the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, later upgraded to the Women's Army Corps, which had full military status. Its members, known as WACs, worked in more than 200 non-combatant jobs stateside and in every theater of war. By 1945, there were more than 100,000 WACs and 6,000 female officers. In the Navy, members of Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, WAVES, held the same status as naval reservists and provided support stateside. The Women's Auxiliary Force of Britain did similar jobs as the Women's Army Corps, as well as some much more exciting work. While not allowed to be trained as pilots, they got to work on Spitfires and used state-of-the-art radar sites to track incoming bomb operations. They were the early warning eyes and ears during the Battle of Britain. The American equivalent, well known as WASP, was much more progressive. They were trained and employed as U.S. Air Force pilots, and while not allowed to do any combat missions and learn little in the way of aerial aerobatics, they were allowed to do everything else, which was a major step forward. Canada had a similar project, the Canadian Women's Corps. Despite promises of glamour and glory, most of the jobs were very simple. They acted as drivers, worked in mess halls where they peeled many a potato, and generally acted like cleaners. Winston Churchill himself thought a woman would not be able to handle the knowledge of causing another person harm, so they were not allowed to use guns. But by the end of the war, they were allowed to do interesting jobs, such as working as carpenters, electricians, and the like. All in all, the Second World War was a catalyst of change for a more equal world. While many policies seemed dated and sexist by today's standards, they were at the time major changes in the attitudes towards women. And while women lost many of these liberties after the war was over, they still proved that they could do more than sit around and look pretty.